I'm Bill McWilliam, president of Cascadero Copper, CCD on the TSX Venture Exchange. Cesium is one of the world's rarest metals with a growing industrial demand. Drilling is underway on our Tehran property in Argentina to prove up a cesium resource. Cascadero's patent-pending leach process has the potential to make Cascadero the lowest cost supplier of cesium in the world. Visit our website, cascadero.com, or phone us at 604-924-5504.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the Corbett Report and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to the show, James.
Konnichiwa, Jim. Glad to be back.
Yes, I can order lots of food in Japanese as well. Thanks to all there's more sushi than Starbucks in Vancouver. North Korea threatening to test a hydrogen bomb somewhere in the Pacific. Well, Japan is right there on the Pacific Ocean. How scary is that?
Well, obviously, this is of great concern to Japan and to the region generally. And we have to obviously take this with a grain of salt. We haven't seen it happen yet, but obviously even the threat, even the possibility of something like this occurring is a very large deal, and one that would obviously even further complicate an already complicated situation. So it is something that is obviously on the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now, which is why there is currently a senior North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs diplomat official who is meeting with a Russian ambassador in Vladivostok today as we speak, basically looking to ease tension somewhat between Washington and Pyongyang. So we'll see what eventuates from that. This is the same diplomat that apparently had an off-the-record meeting with the U.S., a U.S. ambassador earlier this year. So there are signs that perhaps North Korea might be wanting to back a little bit away from this precipice. And if that's the case, I guess we can all breathe some sort of sigh of relief.
Is China backing the sanctions against North Korea?
So far, there has been the political rhetoric about backing these sanctions and China being unhappy with what's going on. But as always, it's a question of whether the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And I think we won't really see this until we see the figures coming out about trade between China and North Korea. Because as we've pointed out before, China has talked the talk of getting tougher with North Korea, but in fact has actually increased trade with North Korea this year. So it remains doubtful whether they're going to follow through on that rhetoric.
Is one of China's fears, if there's war in North Korea, that millions of North Koreans will try to flee to China?
That has to be a concern for China because obviously with the collapse of a North Korean regime and having North Koreans basically looking for some way out of their situation, you have to imagine that the border with China would be an enticing opportunity for a lot of North Koreans in that case. So that's obviously a security situation that China does not want to deal with and is one of its primary concerns when it comes to this. And I think just the idea of the U.S. military also being right at its doorstep if North Korea does collapse, that would obviously be a worrying prospect as well. So China definitely does have some strong incentives for actually making sure that this situation is resolved in some peaceful manner. It's just a question of whether and where and how they're going to bring that pressure to bear.
Source in the Pentagon is quoted as saying, if there is a war with North Korea, about 20,000 South Koreans will die every day. Does that sound about right?
Well, at any rate, I'm not sure about that number, but I have no doubt that a large number of South Koreans would be at risk, would be quite likely killed in the event of invasion or aggression on North Korea, because there is artillery that is hardwired in, so to speak, that is cemented in and ready to fire at a moment's notice on South Korea, and of course on Seoul, which is just a few dozen kilometers from the DMZ zone, and is where the vast majority, or at least half of the South Korean population resides and works. So there is a huge possibility for counterstrike of some sort if North Korea is attacked. And there's very little chance that the U.S. would be able to completely and utterly stop that from happening. So there is no doubt that in the event of some sort of military issue on the Korean Peninsula, we're going to see large numbers of casualties on both sides, doubtless. And that's something that is very much on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, especially, of course, the South Koreans, who in many ways feel like the sitting ducks there.
Do they feel they're pawns in a battle they have little influence in?
I think there are different political factions with different views on the situation, but I think something that everyone should be able to agree on is that it is very unfortunate that the Korean issue has become this international issue that depends more on the actions of, say, China and the U.S. than it does on the Koreans themselves. There is a movement within South Korea and presumably within North Korea as well to not only conclude a peace, but actually to seek reunification as a long-term goal to reunify the Koreas. I mean, this is a situation that is very comparable in some ways to the old situation with East Germany and West Germany, and the fact that this is a country that's been artificially divided by war, and these are peoples with common ancestors and common background, common language, common culture that has been forcefully divided. And I think the long-term goal really does have to be reunification. But I don't think that can be imposed from the outside. The only way that will ever come about is if South and North Koreans are able to open that channel of communication and start negotiating for themselves rather than relying on foreign powers to determine what's going to happen.
Would the people in the South be willing to live under a hard-line communist regime if that allowed reunification?
I imagine a very small percentage of the population might be interested in the North Korean style of government. I imagine the vast majority would not. It would be impossible to say, obviously, how such negotiations would progress, but it would be unlikely, I think, for North Korea to essentially take over the Korean Peninsula in the event of reunification. But certainly, I'm sure some sort of accord could be reached if people could communicate directly rather than going through, official government channels.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
Lotus Ventures Inc. is a BC-based medical marijuana company poised to launch into the rapidly evolving cannabis sector. Lotus is in the final review stage of the Health Canada approvals to become a licensed producer, having arranged facility financing of up to $12 million, plus building permits for its prototype indoor production facility. Shares trade under the symbol J on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Visit our website at lotusventures.ca.
I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp., RMO on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario. With grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold, a drill program will commence this spring to test the numerous targets located by recent groundwork. For more information, visit our website, rmroyalty.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, how are the Asian stock markets taking this H-bomb talk?
Well, obviously, stock markets are down almost pretty much across the board. It hasn't been a precipitous decline because I think a lot of this has already been priced in by the markets that have seen this. But for example, here in Japan, the Nikkei is down about 0.4% on the day so far. So clearly, I think there are still some jitters and worries that are going on. But there are other issues here that are, I think, also contributing to this. In Japan specifically, the big news of the day is that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has just called a snap election about a year in advance of when he was required to call an election. And this is, in some ways, seeking a mandate from the public for Abe's response to the North Korean crisis. Also, a vote of confidence or no confidence on Abe's handling of the economic situation here in Japan, and his proposal to take the proposed coming consumption tax increase, consumption tax here going to raise from 8% to 10% in 2019, and he's proposing to plow at least some of those funds into childhood services and education investment. So I think he's looking for a bit of a mandate from the public for that as well. There's also, of course, a cynical maneuver going on here where the opposition is in somewhat of a state of disarray and a brand new political party has just arisen here, but is brand new, so is unlikely to play a major factor in this election.
What's that brand new party look like? What's their big thing?
It's called the Party of Hope, and it's started by a wildly popular Tokyo governor, Koike here, who got her start as an environment minister under former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. He was a very popular populist leader here about a decade ago, who took an interesting turn after the Fukushima events. He wasn't the prime minister at that time, but since then, he's been quite vocal and quite public about his anti-nuclear stance and the fact that he believes Japan should be weaning itself off of nuclear energy. And it appears that apparently this is going to be one of the planks of this new party's platform, basically the idea of reducing or eliminating nuclear power in Japan and promoting so-called green alternatives and renewable energy sources. So that's going to be one of the planks. Interestingly, although this new party is seen very much as a competitor to Abe and the ruling LDP party, apparently it is very much in accord with Abe and the direction he's taking the country in with regards to security issues. And this new Party of Hope is also apparently going to be interested in revising the constitution to allow for more offensive military capabilities of Japan.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after this.
Aben Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Aben's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at abenresources.com.
Keep informed. Receive our weekly recap of thought-provoking articles, podcasts, and radio delivered to your inbox for free. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage, HowStreet.com. Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, the Chinese government cracking down on cybersecurities. They're still allowing Bitcoin to be used, but they may not in the future. What's going on there, and why are they doing it at this particular time?
So the big news earlier this month was that China was going to be cracking down on and closing the Bitcoin exchanges in China, and this coming from some of the exchanges that had private meetings with government regulators in Beijing earlier this month. So they're looking to wind down their operations now, and more than that, apparently this crackdown is going to be even more thorough. It's a crackdown on initial coin offerings, the new cryptocurrency way of raising funds for business ventures, and other types of economic exchange facilitated through Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Now, it's interesting, this had the immediate effect on the price of Bitcoin to tank prices quite considerably, but prices have largely recovered since then, as the Bitcoin space generally finds that China may not be the most important factor in cryptocurrency pricing. And interestingly, China, the Chinese people, are discovering that they do not need the officially sanctioned, government-approved exchanges in order to facilitate Bitcoin transactions. They're taking to a messaging app that's popular in China called WeChat that has over 900 million users. And they are doing direct exchanges, Bitcoin for money, basically peer-to-peer, in a way that's impossible, really, for the government to completely stop or regulate or crack down on without actually stopping use of services like WeChat. So I think cryptocurrency has always been designed and intended for ways around government regulation and crackdown, and I think we might see the biggest test of that yet coming in China.
Is China cracking down on social media like Facebook, or do they even allow it?
They do. There are, as I say, apps like WeChat, etc. Chinese internet is largely dominated not by the familiar Facebook and Google, etc. that we know, but of Chinese knockoffs of various varieties, Weibo and WeChat and things like this, that are not familiar to Canadian internet users, but are essentially the same idea and offer the same types of messaging services, and those are allowed to operate. There are, of course, limits on what can and cannot be posted, and keywords and other things that are obviously censored. But to a large extent, it does function like a social media service like you would see in Canada. And that, I think, is interesting because, of course, China has also been engaging, specifically over the course of the past year or so, in a crackdown on media generally, but also media available on the internet, including cracking down on video sharing services that formerly it was quite popular to trade, for example, Japanese anime or American television shows and things like this on the video sharing services. That has been cracked down on, so that now only culturally approved things, i.e. more Chinese content, is available on those services. So I think they are trying to influence the direction that these types of services are taking, but they're still allowed to operate, and people, for the large extent, are still allowed to communicate with each other.
Are the Chinese still trying to do their best to get money out so they can buy foreign real estate?
That is certainly, that remains a very lucrative proposition for people who are looking to preserve wealth against potentials for depreciation in the yuan or whatever kinds of roadblocks or bumps they might find along the road. So foreign investment in foreign property still remains quite popular and is still, I think, a preferred way for the newly rich in China to try to get their money out and into something more stable. But of course, the question is, how do you get around the capital controls? In fact, that's not even just a foreign problem anymore. There are just 8 major Chinese cities have just announced new restrictions on property sales within those cities to try to tighten controls on housing sales as a result of that rising house prices that we see in some of the major urban centers. So I think real estate and property quite generally, not just foreign, but also domestic, is quite popular as an investment. And as a result, China is trying to impose even greater regulation and restrictions on those.
New technology in Canada just today allows merchants to use yuan in transactions. Is that something new that you've heard about?
This is something that is increasingly happening in various places around the world. It's part of the internationalization of the renminbi that has been a clear goal of the Chinese government for the last several years and is really taking shape now. There are exchanges in which people can exchange yuan internationally now, and there are futures and other things that are purchasable in yuan. So I think this is part of a trend. And I don't know specifically about the Canadian version of what you're talking about, but it certainly is in accord with what we've seen in other countries around the world over the last several years.
James, is there anything else we should be hearing from Japan right now?
I think that's it. I think that the election is going to be dominating coverage here and the type of conversation that we're seeing. But I think it's all very interesting the way that this is treated politically. These types of economic issues are treated politically, when I think the ground-based reality is that the BOJ is quietly giving up on the idea that they're going to be able to hit their 2% inflation target anytime in the near future. The most recent meeting minutes from the July meeting have just come out, where several of the Bank of Japan Board of Governors were basically discussing the fact that they don't believe that this 2% inflation target is possible anymore. So I think Japan is, yet again, just resigning itself to its never-ending deflationary spiral. And Abe is going to talk a lot of talk in the coming weeks about how he's going to try to pull Japan out of that. But I think just realistically, it's going to be very difficult to see that happening.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for having me on.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com Radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com Radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at talkdigitalnetwork.com. HowStreet.com Radio is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.